Hello, folks. Welcome to Rearing Rambles, Episode 4, Book of Myron. We're all going to take a journey together. Let's all take a quick breath. Breathe in. Breathe out. I am going to enlighten you a little bit. I'm going to talk about a moth that has a lot of meaning for me and that I think is an underappreciated animal. So today, we're going to talk about Darapsa myron, otherwise known as the hog sphinx or Virginia creeper sphinx. This is an insect in the family Sphingidae, subfamily Macroglossinae. It is a moth native to the majority of North America, including most of the US as well as Canada. Anywhere where its hosts can be found, in general, you can find this moth. It's a rather small moth with a wingspan of about 1.5 inches and a body that's just about as long. The stout little moths are very charming in appearance. They're not anything overly spectacular. However, they have a quality to them that's quite intriguing. Darapsa myron is a sphingid that I've worked with for many years. We're going to talk about some of my experiences with this moth and some fun things that I want to know about the moth going forward. So, we'll start with the general biology of Darapsa myron. Darapsa myron is a sphingid that develops during the spring and summer months. It emerges generally around June or July in New England and has at least 2 generations per year in most of its range. The further south you go, the more generations this moth has. In the northern extents, it's univoltine, having a single generation per year. It is a moth that feeds almost exclusively on grape and Virginia creeper, feeding on barely anything else. It's a Vitaceae specialist. We're going to return to this point in a little while. Now, I first became acquainted with this moth back when I was 15 years old. And basically, I had caught a wild female at our security light in our backyard, and I put her in a container. I had intended to use her just as mantis food for a large mantis that I had, but I never got around to it. And the next morning, there were about 80 eggs inside of that container that I was holding her in for the night. As a result of this, I consulted with my Audubon Society insect field guide and identified the moth as Darapsa myron, or the Virginia creeper sphinx. Luckily, my backyard had plenty of Virginia creeper and grape growing in it. Now, as I reared the generation of moth larvae that resulted from this, I noted a couple of interesting things. The first was that the larvae were highly cannibalistic. I was probably keeping them in too crowded of a condition, and I was kind of intimidated by this, so I took the remaining larvae and just distributed them on the Virginia creeper in the woods behind my house, kind of forgetting about the species for a couple of years. So that was my first experience with Darapsa myron. As time went on, I eventually obtained new Darapsa stock. Somebody sent me some eggs. I was in high school at this point. I think it was my junior or senior year, and I was rearing the larvae on Virginia creeper because there was a lot of it in the woods behind my house. I was still living in Connecticut at the time. Here's where things kind of get interesting. So what I found was the larvae, when they're kept at, fairly low densities and provided with enough food, aren't as cannibalistic as I had initially thought. Another interesting thing about the moth is that the adults don't need to feed in order to reproduce, even though they are, they possess a proboscis. I've actually had generations of these moths where the adults just refuse to feed. I offered them food and tried to get them to feed, and they just wouldn't. I've also noted a couple of interesting feeding habits about the adults. One, they aren't that picky. I have had them drink sweat off of my hands. They will drink beer, rotting banana and other fruit juice, nectar, They won't drink blood. I pricked my finger to see if I could get one of these moths to drink my blood, and it wasn't taking it. So I don't think they'll drink blood, but they'll drink a lot of other stuff. But again, the adults don't need to be fed in order to breed. They're actually quite fecund, even without any special care. What I found was that the best way to rear them out was to emerge out 20 or 30 pupae in a 1 foot cubed cage, and just allow the adult moths to do their thing. You put the cage, just outside your door. They do need a little bit of airflow moving through that cage to get them to mate. Mating is pretty brief. Generally, what happens is I will come out to the cage just after sunset, because the mating window is generally right after the sun goes down until about 11 or 12 at night. And there'll be some mating pairs. And then what will happen is I will have the females flying around ovipositing within a couple hours. And so you can't necessarily rely on whether or not the adults are still mating in the morning to determine if they've mated. But trust me, if you see eggs, they've probably mated. What I found is that the adult females wait about 8 or 9 days without mating before they start to lay infertile eggs. And so if you have adult females that are laying eggs before this, they're almost certainly fertile. And so I have been rearing these moths for a couple of generations, and what I noted in Connecticut and Rhode Island was there were 3 generations, even though the books usually say 2. Development from the egg to adult is very rapid. The egg takes 4 to 6 days to hatch, and you can very easily determine if the egg is fertile within a couple days of it being laid. It's basically starts out green. If it's green to clear, there's no baby in here. Green to yellow, you've got a little fellow, and that's the developing baby inside, which is why the egg turns yellow. The eggs will hatch. Now, they will cannibalize very young if they're not fed pretty quickly after they hatch. So my recommendation to people looking to rear this moth is to keep a close eye on those eggs, and as soon as they start hatching, start moving them onto host plant material. I find that I can very gently just pick them up by their little anal horns with my finger and thumb, plop them on a piece of host plant material. I'll usually put 10 to 15 larvae in a cup with a couple of grape leaves, and then they're good to go for a couple days. It's a pretty easy species to work with, but there are some caveats. This species can be disease prone, and I figured out a couple of workarounds for that. So first, in the larval stage, they can be pretty prone to infection. So what I do generally is I keep the larval densities somewhat low. Even though the larvae only get to be about 2 inches in length at maturity, I usually use those shoebox size clear sterilite bins with the white tops. I'm sure everybody knows what those are, what they look like. That's my classic insect like Lepidoptera rearing bin. It's a perfect size for most things. You do want to be careful about how many larvae you crowd into one of those bins for disease reasons, especially as they get older. Although I've gotten away with 20 to 30 mature myron larvae in one of those bins, I generally keep the densities closer to about half that. For various reasons. Part of it is, the potential for cannibalism, especially if you're not changing the food out constantly. But the other problem is sometimes diseases will break out among them. And sometimes they happen with no rhyme or reason. One of the things that I've noticed as a mechanism of preventing some disease during particularly humid parts of the year was to rear the larvae on Boston ivy, Parthenochussis tricuspidata. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's not a United States native plant, but the larvae will still eat it. They won't switch to it from Parthenochussis quinquefolia, Virginia creeper, but if you start the larvae on Boston ivy, they will continue to eat Boston ivy. This is also good for late broods because this moth likes to push the envelope. I'll talk about my experience with getting these moths to diapause in a few minutes. But they will eat Boston ivy, which is a Parthenocissus species. It's a congener to one of their native hosts. Even though Boston ivy, despite the name, is from Japan, it's not from Boston. It's just called Boston ivy, and it's a very common ornamental plant. When I went to the University of Rhode Island, I could basically find whatever hosts that I needed for my things. Here in Colorado, there is a lot of Virginia creeper in places, so I can rear Darapsa myron. More on that later on in this episode. So we have, let's just continue on with my story, shall we? This is rearing rambles. You're gonna, you gotta expect me to ramble a little bit. It'll be fun. So high school comes and goes. And in preparation for going to college, I released all of the Darapsa larvae that I had, and adults. And then when I realized that I could rear them on campus, I obtained more eggs and larvae from people, and I literally reared them under the bunk bed in my dorm room. When I started my college experience, I lived with somebody my freshman year who had lived a very sheltered life. He was from New York, and he had never really come across anybody who wasn't like him. And I feel bad, and I wish that he had more, better experiences. He was also kind of a jerk. Um, he didn't really know that I was rearing the myron under my bed, which was fine. But I had kept the myron under my bed, and then when they pupated, I put the pupae in my part of the fridge. I'm sure you can imagine. My half of the refrigerator didn't have food in it. It had life forms that I was getting through the winter. Um, and this is obviously until I joined a lab on campus where I could keep my stuff in the refrigerator there. But this was, a couple of months before that. Um, I'm going somewhere with this, trust me. Um, so yeah, that was fun. Um, my first year at URI, I had an interesting experience with Darapsa myron. I had some pupae that were developing, and it was now September, and there were pupae that were emerging still, which was a little bit of a shocker. I had reared the larvae outdoors, and I put the pupae in an outdoor container because I was having a hard time getting captive larvae to diapause. And what I found was that they really need a lot of dark because they develop so quickly. It's maybe 20 to 23 days from hatching to pupation. And so if they get too much light during that time, they're just going to go to the next generation. 14 to 20 days later, the adults will emerge rather than the pupae diapause. And so I had reared some of these larvae outdoors on the grapevines at URI's East Farm. And some of them were emerging. Not all of them emerged. Some of them did. Some of them were like, let's just wait until next year, guys, which was great. Some had emerged. And I was like, oh, crud, what am I going to do? So I took one of those net cages, and I put an unmated fresh adult female into that cage, left the cage open outdoors, and I left for the night. When I came back just before sunrise the next morning, here's where things get interesting. My female was gone, but there was a wild male that had come in the middle of the night to that female who was still in that cage, which was good and bad. Bad because I had lost my female, but good because now I had a male. Because I had females emerging and no males, and so I figured, why don't I just give it a shot and see if there are wild males to attract around here? What I will say is that in Rhode Island where I lived, giraffes and myron were kind of hit or miss. You could set females out, and sometimes they'd attract a wild mate, sometimes they wouldn't. And there was really no pattern to it. It kind of was just at the whim of nature, and I don't know if that's just a reflection of maybe the population of Darapsa myron goes up and down, or maybe Darapsa myron is more short-lived than originally anticipated. I mean, they are pretty short-lived as adults, so maybe the emergence pattern outside is such where if the female doesn't emerge like within a day or two of the male in the wild, then he's not going to come to her. I also don't know if just because Darapsa myron has been known to be localized to certain regions. And maybe I was just too far from an area that had a strong population. Because if I were to go a couple miles south of Kingston, Rhode Island, right along the shoreline where there's a ton of grape, or to Block Island, there'd be a lot of myron that you could find on the grapevines and things like that. So it could have been that. In any case, there would sometimes be males that came to my females, sometimes there wouldn't be, but I didn't know that yet because I had just gotten to this area of Rhode Island and, I was doing other stuff. So I got the male in the cage, and that same day, another female emerged. So I put the two together in that cage, closed the cage, and left it for the night. Later on the next day, the male died, but then the female began to lay eggs that night, and guess what? Those eggs happened to be fertile. They hatched. So what must have happened was, these moths did their business that one night before the male died, after I had captured him from the wild, attracted him with my female from the night before. And so I like to tell that story because it's just really interesting. The female managed to find her way out of that cage, but the male didn't. And I don't really have any like religious or spiritual beliefs, but if there was ever like the universe telling me something, that would probably be one of the only things that I would attribute that to. Um, Not that I attribute that to that, but it does kind of make me stop and think. I try to keep an open mind about things, even if I think they're bunk. So anyway, I'm working on rearing Darapsa myron, as well as Actius luna and some other species. Um, and I am beginning to ask some scientific questions. So, my first publication in the scientific literature involves Darapsa myron, and it was an experiment that I had run on the suitability of an invasive vitaceous plant. And here's where we get back to the Boston ivy. I hadn't yet worked on rearing this moth on Boston ivy, I will say that. Um, that wouldn't come for another year. But what had happened was there's a plant called Ampelopsis brevipedunculata, also known as porcelain berry. It is an invasive relative of the grape, Vitis labrusca and its allies. Yilsa, Vitis riparia, Vitis, forget what the other ones are. Vitis vinifera is the, domestic grape, but, that wasn't very common in Rhode Island. It was mostly labrusca, vinifera, and hybrids between the two. And so Ampelopsis is very closely related to grape. It's the Vitaceae. And so I was wondering, hey, can Darapsa myron feed on Ampelopsis? So I set out to run an experiment. I collected the seeds of both wild grapes and Ampelopsis. I also took hardwood cuttings of everything. I ended up having to just go out to the sites where these plants were growing and cut off sections and refrigerate them, just because I was using up so much foliage that the plants that I had started were just too small. But what are you going to do? That's science. Sometimes things don't always work the right way, but we had done an experiment where we were weighing larvae at regular intervals and figuring out how quickly they were growing in both Ampelopsis and grape. Turns out Darapsa myron larvae don't like to be bothered all that much because in both groups there was very high mortality, and I attribute that to literally plucking the larvae off of their foliage, weighing them, putting them back in. That's got to be very stressful for a larva. They're not the tiniest larvae that exists, but it definitely is stressful for them. But nonetheless, there was definitely higher survival in the grape group than the Ampelopsis group. And what we concluded was that Ampelopsis is not a very suitable food resource for Darapsa myron, and it's going to be kind of a concern if Ampelopsis overgrows in areas where grape used to be, and now this moth is kind of out of luck, out of options for food. So that was my first publication that involved this moth. So it is a fun moth. I have also used it for other scientific experiments that I will outline in just a moment. My relationship with this moth is definitely a positive one, and it's definitely one that I want to continue building. I kind of view species as entities, and I really like to interact with as many different species as I possibly can. So, have I bored everybody yet? No, I'm just kidding. I was curious about parasitism. I started to do scientific experiments with parasitoids, and one of those species that I wanted to look at parasitism in was Darapsa myron. So I have a couple of stories. None of this really got published, unfortunately, but I have a few stories. Let's go. I first started by setting Darapsa larvae out on the grapes around East Farm at URI at different instars to see if there were ages at which the larvae were most susceptible to different parasitoids. Now, there were a couple of problems with my experiment, mostly the fact that I didn't set out enough larvae from each instar in order to retrieve a reliable number back. I did see a couple instances of parasitism by Cotesia and by Megacelia, but in general, it wasn't really enough to publish any results on, unfortunately. My mentee and I also did a project where we deployed the Darapsa larvae on different houseplants, grape and Virginia creeper, to compare the parasitism rates. And again, guess what happened? We didn't get enough back to say anything. A lot of these studies where you set out caterpillars, bring them back in and see what the parasitism looks like are very, very tricky to run because you need, and as prolific as Darapsa are, you still need to have a great number of those larvae to set out to bring back in. But I'm stubborn, okay? I'm very stubborn. We also did an experiment with, we tried to do an experiment where we had grapes that were both wild and domesticated versions of grape, just regular Concord grape. And we pre-grazed some of the grapevines with Darapsa larvae before deploying them outside with Darapsa larvae. And again, we didn't get enough larvae back to say anything. There was one instance of parasitism by some weird dipteran, but it might have been a hyperparasitoid. I don't really know. But we definitely tried. We definitely did some attempts at using this moth. I advocate for this moth to be a good model system. It's very small. It's very easy to rear in large numbers. Very prolific, very easy to work with. I mean, aside from a couple of little blips with like the diseases and cannibalism, but other sphingids that people use as models, like Hylaeus lineata and Manduca sexta, are also cannibals. They also have some of these issues. They're harder to get the adults to mate because not only do the adults need to be fed, they need to be provided with live houseplant material that they can smell so they can mate and oviposit. It's a pain in the neck. You don't have to do that with Darapsa myron or any of the Darapsa species. And so I do have some other stories about little things I've tried with Darapsa. So I was working on Darapsa, and I collected a Manduca larva from outside that had the Cotesia congregata living inside of it. And guess what? Those Cotesia started to emerge, and I decided to try and see if they would infect Darapsa myron larvae, because Darapsa myron is a recorded host of Cotesia congregata. Now, I don't know if specific subpopulations of Cotesia congregata attack myron or if all subpopulations of Cotesia. What I'm getting at is I don't know if, the wasps that come out of a Manduca larva are going to want to attack Darapsa larvae, or if that's just, maybe it's a different subspecies or variant. I don't really know. But the Darapsa larvae that were exposed to these Cotesia didn't end up getting any Cotesia out of them. And I don't know if the Darapsa larvae were just too old for the Cotesia to want to go after, or if the Cotesia didn't even recognize them as a suitable host in the first place. I don't know. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about. I also know that Darapsa myron was a recorded host for the introduced to kinfly Compsillera conxonata, and so I had a Compsillera colony, and I put some Darapsa larvae in with Compsillera because I had extra Darapsa, and I was trying to produce larger numbers of the Compsillera. And guess what? The Compsillera didn't attack those either. So host records can kind of be a funny thing. Why don't we talk about that next? Whenever you're working with an insect, you want to know what its hosts are. This applies for both herbivorous things and parasitoids, especially. there is a database of different host plants for different lepidopterans. And Darapsa myron has apparently been recorded feeding on viburnum. I think that's a bunch of BS. And what I suspect is that either the Darapsa was misidentified because Darapsa versicolor larvae will eat viburnum, and it's possible that somebody thought the versicolor larva was myron, I don't know, or the viburnum was misidentified because there are some viburnums that have foliage that looks very similar to that of grape. And grape doesn't always grow as a strict vine. It can be kind of a shrubby type thing. So it's very possible there was some misidentification there. Another issue is that just because there's a caterpillar sitting on a plant doesn't mean the caterpillar's been feeding on that plant. And this is something that often gets ignored by host records. You don't always know if that caterpillar's on that plant for the purpose of eating it. I know it's hard to believe, but sometimes caterpillars wander and they're sitting on things that aren't their food. Okay? And so I don't think Darapsa myron actually feeds on viburnum. I also am skeptical of whether or not Compsoglyra will attack Darapsa myron. Again, there's a possibility of misidentification of either the host or the feeder of the host. And so because of that, but again, just because I didn't get these Compsoglyra to attack the Darapsa doesn't necessarily mean that the Compsoglyra will never go after Darapsa. There could have been, so many other factors involved there. And so, I caution people all the time what sorts of conclusions they draw from observations. Observations are good. They're always good. You always want as much data in front of you as possible, okay? Because a very full, set of data, no matter what that data is, can really be helpful because later down the road you can go and, exclude stuff that's not relevant, but you can't ever add stuff to a data set if it's not there in the first place. And so, I do like, having as many different observations of something as possible, but they can't always get you to the big picture. And so, whether or not Darapsa myron will indeed feed on viburnum, which I doubt just because I've never gotten them to feed on viburnum, but what I will say is viburnum is a huge genus. Matter of fact, let me just Google how many species are in the genus viburnum right now. There are close to 200 species of viburnum. And so there definitely are, viburnum species that I've never played around with. I've played around with the grape or maple leaf viburnum and a few other things, but of course, that doesn't tell us much. So it's very possible this moth will feed on viburnum. So it's very possible that the host record is a misidentification. Now, why don't we talk about the other two species of the genus Darapsa real quick? I've also worked with Darapsa troworlis, but not nearly as much. Darapsa troworlis is the azalea sphinx. So, it is a slightly larger species, and it is known to feed on various plants, such as members of the Ericaceae and viburnum, which is in the Ataxaceae. And it is probably the most generalist member of the genus, because if it indeed has host plants in multiple families, that sets it apart from both Darapsa myron and Darapsa versicolor. Now, Darapsa versicolor is also a habitat specialist, being only found in wetlands. So Darapsa versicolor feeds on both hydrangea, decadon, and buttonbush. Decadon is in the Lyraceae, and then Buttonbush is in the Rosaceae, I believe. No, the Rubiaceae, sorry. So, Darapsa myron has hosts in one family. Darapsa versicolor has hosts in possibly Darapsa choerlis has hosts in possibly two families, with members of the Ericaceae like mountain laurel and rhododendron being the most commonly utilized hosts, as well as viburnum, which may also be used by versicolor. I'm not entirely sure, but versicolor has hosts in three families. And it's a habitat specialist. We can have a whole conversation about generalists versus specialists and how there are different axes at which generalism and specialism exist, because you can be a dietary generalist but a habitat specialist or a season specialist. Like tent caterpillars are generalist feeders, but they can only feed on host plant material that's very young, so they have to come out at a very early part of the year, when the last frosts are still coming in, when the hosts are just starting to break bud. And so generalists and specialists are terms that are very nuanced. And we're going to see, in future episodes of the podcast, I'm going to talk about some other groups of moths where you see in the same genus different degrees of generalization and specialization. One example will be the Calosamia, but I'm not going to tell you guys about that today because we're talking about Darapsa myron specifically. So this sphingid is a very interesting organism. I have a lot of love for it. When I came here to Fort Collins, Colorado, I had released all of my Darapsa myron because I wasn't sure I'd find the host plants, but lo and behold, Fort Collins is teeming with Virginia creeper. So I ordered some eggs from somebody, but I had some problems once they pupated. The pupae weren't emerging and the adults weren't breeding. And I'm not entirely sure why, but I have a couple of guesses. Now, I'm not going to say inbreeding. I will have an episode as to why I think inbreeding is a little bit of an overused scapegoat. I'm not saying that inbreeding never causes problems, but what I am saying is that inbreeding isn't the big bad wolf we think it is. I suspect what happened was because of how different, these were people in California who sent me Darapsa myron eggs. I suspect that just the host plants, the Virginia creeper here, was maybe poor quality because of really dry, hot conditions this past summer. Because that can happen. You can have, there's something called the plant stress hypothesis. And plant stress hypothesis is this idea that when plants are under some kind of stress, be it drought stress or maybe light stress or something, they differ in their they can change in their palatability to herbivores. In some cases, they become more palatable because the defensive compounds they would use to ward off those herbivores are lacking because the plant's not putting energy into that. In other instances, however, the plant may not be nutritious enough for that insect to develop correctly on. There's a lot we don't know about nutrition in insects. What I do know as well is that when I have, like last brood Darapsa myron that really hang on in like the months of like November and even December, and they're still developing as larvae, they have fertility problems the next spring when they emerge out and they, lay eggs that just end up not hatching. And I suspect improper nourishment is more of a factor than inbreeding, but I could be wrong. I just have a suspicion that, there could be some nutritional deficiencies caused by hosts that are senescing or hosts that are heat and drought stressed and things like that. So that's my interpretation of what happened. Now, could it also be a problem with inbreeding? Sure. However, I think inbreeding problems would be one of your last things to look to, and we'll have an episode specifically about that. But for now, We're going to just talk about Darapsa myron, nutrition, and things like that. And I'll have another episode where I have an even greater evidence for this nutritional inadequacy hypothesis of mine. We know that nutritional inadequacy can affect the fertility of insects, even if it doesn't affect them in any visible way. Like you can have an adult come out of the pupa, form perfectly, be the right size and things, but just internally there's something wrong. That's what I'm wondering. If that happens, um, because you would think that. I have also found wilder up some myron larvae on the hosts out here. And I wonder if there's just, if a locally adapted population would do better. This is a moth with a wide range across the United States. So, where do we go from here? Um, I like to rear Darapsa myron. I like to talk to people about it. It is my favorite sphingid and one of my favorite moths. Um, I have had a lot of fun experiences, and it's been great to get to know this species. And I wish to learn more about them. I wish to learn about their mechanism of diapause, some of their natural enemies and their interactions with their natural enemies, things like that, as well as, just some of their adaptations to different hosts. Why is it that they can feed on Parthenocissus tricuspidatum, but not Ampelopsis brevipeduculata? Now, there is a native Ampelopsis species on the east coast that presumably Darapsa would feed upon. And so I don't know, maybe the chemistry of Parthenocissus tricuspidatum compared to quinquefolia is similar enough to permit that feeding to occur, whereas with Ampelopsis brevipeduculata and I think it's Ampelopsis incarnata, but let me just double check. Ampelopsis cordata, sorry, Ampelopsis cordata is a U.S. native pepper vine. It's not an invasive. That Darapsa myron is known to feed on. So I might, try to grow some. I'm going to see seeds for sale of this species. They are selling them. Yeah. Wow, I like that. Oh, it's out of stock, darn it. I'll have to find it somewhere else. But anyway. I leave you all with just my final thoughts. This is a really cool, really fun moth that I don't think gets enough appreciation by moth folks. I don't see too many people rearing them. They are fun. I always love when the mature larvae turn like a purpley color and then make their cocoons and then they pupate. Really cool stuff to see. And I suggest that people just engage with nature. You'll definitely see some future podcast episodes where I talk about like, hey guys, I raised this random geometric species just because I caught a wild female and I wanted to raise the eggs. That's how a lot of my rearing adventures have gone, and I'm just fine with that. I think it's fun. I think it's cool. You learn a lot, and you engage with nature in a way that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. And so, until the next one, I hope everyone does, well, and thank you for tuning in.